Good evening, friends. Welcome to Tuesday webinar sessions of a series of sessions from Critical Care Department, Emergency Medicine and Allied Super Specialties from Yasoda Group of Organization. And we have an interesting topic today. We commonly encountered hematological emergencies in intensive care unit. So today we have Dr. Karun Kumar, who is a specialist in hematology, and he will be discussing about the hematological emergencies in intensive care. He is a dynamic, young, talented hematologist available with us. So over to you, Dr. Karun Kumar, for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you for the kind introduction, sir. So today's is really a special topic. See, as a hematologist, just a minute, can you see the screen?
Share the screen, sir.
Just a minute, I think I have to share the screen.
Yeah, it's visible, sir. Make it slide full screen.
Okay.
Full screen, yeah. Good
Yes.
to go.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So coming to the topic, as a hematologist, usually most of our practice includes, most of the time patients with critical hematological values. Patients coming with severe anemia, severe thrombocytopenia, and severe leukopenia or extreme sites, leukocytosis, thrombocytosis. So most of our practice, we see critically ill patients. So among these, in some of the cases, we may have to manage these patients with the help of ICU team. In those scenarios, I think it's very important for the ICU team to understand the intricacies of hematological disorders, which they are not exposed to routine. So the main interest, of presenting this topic to all of you is to prime the intensive care physicians and registrars over there to understand how these hematological diseases are unique when it comes to management in ICU. So I've chosen few topics. Actually, it's an extensive topic. There are many things to discuss. I'll try to brief and cut down topic and speak most important things from the list here. So these emergencies, hematological emergencies, can present in two ways. So one is it can be an initial presentation. The patient come with those emergencies to emergency department or land up straight in ICU. That is one way. The other way is they'll be under us being managed and they develop complication in between and then we take them to intensive care unit. So either way, either emergency physicians or intensive care unit, they can be exposed, or as a secondary exposure from hematology department, we can share the care of these patients. That's why it's always important to know what are the uniqueness in these hematological malignancies or emergencies. So to put it simply, if you classify, there are emergencies that can be benign or malignant. So among benign, thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura, and autoimmune hemolytic anemia, sickle cell crisis. These are the ones which are important. Among hematological malignancies, which present with hyperleukocytosis, hypercalcemia, hyperviscosity, tumor lysis syndrome, the spinal cord compression, and superior vena cava syndrome. So when you come to, I'll start with the malignancies and then I'll go to the benign part. So in the benign part, I would love to highlight the autoimmune hemolytic anemia. Usually these patients present to emergency department with severe pallor and icterus. They'll be in severe breathlessness, and time matters here. So when the patient is in emergency department with severe pallor and jaundice, we have to get this direct Coombs test as soon as possible. If you look at the LFTs, it's more of indirect hyperbilirubinemia. Once you see indirect hyperbilirubinemia and severe anemia, it straight away goes towards autoimmune hemolytic anemia, confirmed with direct Coombs test. And then comes the role of management here. So what you should do in these patients? So oxygen is most important in this patient. Even though the respiratory compromise may not be there, they may not be in failure, but always start with oxygen support till you get blood product support. So always it's incompatible in the blood bank. So what will you do? Always get a least incompatible unit and you start steroids, high dose steroids, and transfuse along with it. So most of the cases with these precautions, usually we can avoid major transfusion reactions. Severe autoimmune hemolytic anemias, transfusion is indicated. Okay. So this is the most important aspect of autoimmune hemolytic anemia. So coming to the topic proper, I'll start with hematological malignancy and I'll come back to TTP in the last slide if time permits. We'll start with the case. This is one of my patients presented in 2018 with a 50-year-old male, came with altered sensorium and drowsiness. He had history of low back pain for 3 months. I've just simplified investigations here for the time purpose. He had anemia, thrombocytopenia, and peripheral smooth showed Rollier formation. Total protein was elevated, the globulins were high, and he had hypercalcemia, with 13. Bone marrow showed 90% plasma. So this is a case of multiple myeloma. So what are we dealing here? What is the emergency we are dealing here? This is hypercalcemia. So hypercalcemia can be seen in other non-hematological disorders, but we as a hematologist, I'll be talking only about multiple myeloma. So the presence of hypercalcemia in a patient with cancer is an adverse prognostic factor predicting a shorter survival. So appropriate management it plays a very important role in these cases. There are various reasons for hypercalcemia depending on the disease over here. So it can be parathormone related peptide, which can happen in solid organ malignancies. Just a minute. Or it can be PTH itself, or vitamin 125 dihydroxy polycalciferol, which happens in very rare case of lymphomas. Osteolysis. In myeloma, what happens? There is an activation of, so there are so many mechanisms happening in between. There is activation of Frank ligand, there is secretion of cytokines. The activation of osteoclasts lead to resorption of bone. It's kind of osteolysis, which releases calcium into the blood. So this causes hypercalcemia and multiple myeloma. So what are the symptoms? There are a multitude of symptoms. Common among these are, depending on the severity of hypercalcemia, there can be symptoms. So constitutional symptoms, CNS related symptoms, lethargy, confusion, other symptoms like nausea, constipation. So these are the common symptoms. Severe cases, so there is a chance of cardiac dysrhythmias, which is very important, such as bradycardia, shortening of QT interval, even cardiac arrest. So because of the implications over here, it's very important to evaluate any patient with altered sensorium, look for calcium levels and other. So how do you diagnose hypercalcemia? So it goes by clinical picture and should have high index of suspicion for these disorders. Here, the patient had history of long low backache, long history of low backache. On evaluation, there was high protein. There is roller formation in the blood. So then suspect myeloma was suspected. So how do you treat hypercalcemia? Just I'll go very brief on this. So first is you hydrate patient. You always hydrate the patient. Then there are two kinds of therapy here, which acts in a short duration and which act on a longer duration. What are the shorter acting drugs? You give calcitonin because this has a tachyphylaxis. There will be dose effect. So the first 2 days calcitonin works very nicely, but soon the action wanes. So you overlap calcitonin with a zolentronic, a bisphosphonate, which is a pamintronate or zolentronic acid. And in multiple myeloma, treatment matters. So hypercalcemia, supportive care is important. Simultaneously, you treat the patient with chemotherapy. So steroid, glucocorticoids plays a very important role in these patients. In those patients who have a renal compromise, we can use denosumab, but costly, if affordable, we can try this drug in these patients. So then there's one more complication which can land up the patient in emergency department is hyperviscosity. Sometimes, so relating only to the hematological disorders over here. So Wallerstone macroglobulinemia is one more hematological disorder where the patient can present with the hyperviscosity. So what happens here is IgM monoclonal protein, which is increased drastically, usually more than 3 grams. IgM is a pentamer. It causes the high levels increases the viscosity of the blood, so leading to symptoms. So what are the symptoms here? So headache, dizziness, vertigo, even seizure sometimes, and visual blurring, ophthalmologic symptoms. There can be mucocutaneous bleeding also in these patients. it interferes with the platelet and von Willebrand function, thereby leading to mucocutaneous bleeding in this patient. So one more hematological emergency which can present the bleeding or CNS symptoms, seizures, blurring of vision is a hyperviscous secondary to high IgM monoclonal protein, which is seen in Waldenstrom. Waldenstrom is not a common disease. Usually multiple myeloma, we see IgG, IgA, even high levels of IgG, IgA, Ig will not cause hyperviscosity, but the hyperviscosity is unique to IgM monoclonal protein. So I'm bringing all similar, the multiple myeloma related emergencies here. Other one is spinal cord compression. So this in oncological practice can be seen in solid organ malignancies like metastasis of prostate or renal cell malignancies and all. So I'm dealing with multiple myeloma and lymphoma here, which can cause cord compression. And again, this is an emergency. Why emergency? If not acted immediately, it can lead to loss of neurological function in these patients. It's about 5 to 10% of cases of spinal cord compression have multiple myeloma and lymphoma as etiology. So usually what happens, the clinical, how do you suspect malignancy here or myeloma here? Usually again, the patient will have a long history of low back pain, which was neglected or not evaluated properly, which will be followed suddenly by a sensory motor deficits and the sphincteric alterations. MRI spine is the choice. You recognize the lesion over there. And how do you treat? There are 3 different ways to treat. One is steroids. Obviously, myeloma steroid plays a very important role in relieving the compression over there, because these myeloma plasma cells are very sensitive to corticosteroids. So the other modalities of treatment in these patients are radiotherapy and decompressive surgery. When there is a spinal instability, decompressive surgery plays a crucial role in these patients. Okay, then coming to the other part, leukemias. So next topics I'll be dealing emergencies related to leukemias. So I'll first take tumor lysis syndrome. So what is tumor lysis syndrome? It's a constellation of metabolic derangements resulting from the death of neoplastic cells, which release their intracellular contents into the circulation. Basically, a malignant cell lyses and releases all its intracellular constituents into the blood. So where do we see this? Usually we see this in very aggressive hematological cancers, such as high-grade lymphomas and acute leukemias. So what are high-grade lymphomas? Their cells divide very rapidly and they're fragile and usually they give away. So such malignancies, we see this tumor lysis syndrome. So it can occur in 2 ways. So the patient can come to you to the emergency department or land up in ICU in spontaneous tumor lysis syndrome. So this is called spontaneous. You are not given a therapy and the cells has gone lysis without treatment. This is called spontaneous. Or we treat them in hematology ward and during chemotherapy, they develop tumor lysis. So what happens here, once the cancer cell lysis happens, there is a nucleic acid breakdown, which leads to purine catabolism, release of hypoxanthine and xanthine, and conversion to uric acid. Here, hypoxanthine and xanthine are less soluble, whereas uric acid is a very more soluble, hypoxanthine and xanthine. So xanthine oxidase converts them to uric acid, and uric acid has a low solubility. There comes the problem. So this leads to deposition of uric acid, leading to further renal complications. Also, simultaneously, there are other substances which are released into the blood, like potassium, phosphorus. Okay, so hyperkalemia has its own adverse effects. Hyperkalemia, we all know, it causes arrhythmias, paresthesias, weakness, and myalgias. So hyperphosphatemia, so it can lead to, again, it binds with calcium and causes secondary hypocalcemia, deposits in renal, leading to renal failure, and again, these can cause seizures. So here you can see the metabolic disturbances which are happening very rapidly. It's very difficult to keep these patients in ward and monitor them. So these patients will require ICU support. So in the ICU support, these are monitored for all these ECG changes and electrolyte disturbances and all, and managed accordingly. So classification, how do you classify? We call, there are 2 terms, laboratory and clinical tumor lysis syndrome. Laboratory tumor lysis syndrome is defined when the patient has 2 or more features of hyperuricemia more than 8, potassium more than 6, phosphorus more than 4.5 milligram per deciliter, or calcium less than 5. So they should have 2 or more of these 4 features. And we call clinical tumor lysis syndrome, and the patient has laboratory features, and also additionally one of the following, which is creatinine more than 1.5 times the upper limit of normal. Cardiac arrhythmia, the patient has a sudden death with these laboratory features, then it's clinical tumor lysis syndrome. See, you can see these metabolic disturbances can be extremely dangerous to the patient and can cause even sudden death. So there comes monitoring these patients. So why it's important? So recognition. So once your patient is diagnosed with a malignancy, say high-grade lymphoma or leukemia, we should expect tumor lysis prior, and we should keep the patient on proper monitoring, and we should have certain access to the certain important drugs. I'll be talking about this. So how do you prevent tumor lysis in these patients? First thing is identify patient properly and initiate prophylactic therapy in high-risk cases, hydrate them properly, and appropriate use of uric acid lowering drugs. So here the choice of uric acid, reducing the uric acid, we have allopurinol, rasburicase. So allopurinol is a inhibitor of xanthine oxidase. These changes are not saved here, just a minute. Okay, sorry. So choice of the drugs, allopurinol, febuxostat versus rasburicase. How do you choose the drugs in this patient? Usually, if you look at the image, the allopurinol acts over here. It inhibits xanthine oxidase, which converts hypoxanthine, xanthine to uric acid. So once this xanthine oxidase is inhibited, what happens? There will be excess of hypoxanthine, which is more soluble. Thereby, nucleic acid breakdown, what are the products are excreted easily. So febuxostat is also a selective inhibitor of xanthine oxidase with certain benefits. So what are the benefits of febuxostat? Allopurinol over febuxostat. So allopurinol is an appropriate uricosuric drug in patients with low or intermediate risk of TLS. And just a minute. So febuxostat has a fewer drug-to-drug interactions, and in renal patients with mild to moderate renal impairment, febuxostat is better tolerated than allopurinol. So here, if you look at the image, the allopurinol, usually once the uric acid formed, it doesn't reduce the uric acid levels. So always remember, why do we start allopurinol prior to chemotherapy? Usually allopurinol, what it does, it reduces the formation of uric acid. So once at the time of diagnosis, if the patient has high uric acid levels, then allopurinol will not work. So what you should do in those cases, you should choose rasburicase. So what does rasburicase do? It usually acts on uric acid and makes, so it's a urate oxidase and metabolized uric acid allantoin, which is more soluble. So in cases where there is hyperuricemia to start with, or during the treatment, the patient develops high uric acid levels, rasburicase is the ideal drug. So what are the precautions you should take? Ideally, always screen for G6PD deficiency in these patients. When you use rasburicase, there can be extensive hemolysis, complicating the clinical scenario in these patients. So always screen for G6PD, you'll get the report in 2 to 3 hours. So once it's normal, then you can safely give rasburicase. So there are 2 ways. Actually, rasburicase is not so easy to use. It's a little bit costly drug. If you use the proper dose, it really becomes costly. It may cost some 60,000-70,000 bucks, which is to the care of leukemia, which is already costly. So what we do, we just try very low dose. 1.5. The vial comes in a 1.5 mg dose and 3 mg dose. We just try and give 1.5 mg dose to these patients. It works wonders most of the time. Usually the uric acid levels comes down, and usually the renal function improves. We see dramatic improvement in these patients. But in those patients who don't respond to lower dose of rasburicase, we don't have option. We have to fix to the standard dose, which is 0.2 mg per kg for 5 days. This already I've discussed. And other parts of tumor lysis syndrome, the two things, hyperphosphatemia and hyperkalemia. How do you control hyperphosphatemia? minimize phosphate intake and use phosphate binders. Hyperkalemia, we all know, dextrose insulin bolus, calcium gluconate when there is changes in ECG, and use K-bind to reduce absorption, and salbutamol nebulizations. And in unresponsive cases, refractory cases, hemodialysis. So next, we go into the one more topic related to leukemias. So this is a 40-year-old man admitted 2 weeks ago with bleeding and WBC of 12,000. He was diagnosed with APML. So aggressive blood product support is emergency initiated. All-trans retinoic acid is emergently started, and anthracycline-based chemotherapy is administered. To your knowledge, APML is a very special among all hematological malignancies. How is it special? Earlier it used to be very dangerous malignancy because by the time the patient are diagnosed and they come to tertiary care center, they used to bleed to death. The APML cases. So after once the ATRA, and when we got targeted drugs like all-trans retinoic acid and ATO in these patients, the management totally improved, the outcomes have totally improved. So when we have an APML patient in our ward, this is very special to us, and these patients should be aggressively managed. Why? So there are two aspects to this. Firstly, these patients initially present with very bad bleeding tendencies, or they can clot also. So why the promyelocytic cells in these patients, the APML cells in these patients, have a very predilection to adhesion, and they cause DAC kind of picture in the blood, leading to bleeding. Simultaneously, they can also stimulate a thrombotic environment in the blood. So what is the target in these patients? We should reduce promyelocytes as soon as possible and convert these promyelocytes into neutrophils as soon as possible. These two are the targets. So once APML is diagnosed, priority is to start ATRA as soon as possible. Second is, so once these APML patients start improving, there comes the second problem. So that's described here. So this patient, if you look at this patient, so this patient was diagnosed with APML and he was started on ATRA and anthracycline-based chemotherapy on day 18. So this patient has a peculiar problem. So what happens here? The patient has fever, cough, pulmonary infiltrates, and right side pleural effusion. So what does it look like? So any leukemia patient on treatment, if he develops respiratory symptoms and infiltrates in the lung, we assume most of the time it has an infection. It's a LRTI, pneumonia. So, but here, the first diagnosis in APML should be of a differentiation syndrome or a retinoic acid syndrome. Why? Because what happens during the treatment in these patients, once the ATRA is initiated, so there will be differentiation. These abnormal promyelocytes starts developing into neutrophils. So while they're getting converted or mature to neutrophils, a lot of cytokines are released into the blood. And there is a lot of change in the surface nature of these neutrophils, which have more adhesive properties. So these maturing neutrophils will go and infiltrate the lung parenchyma spaces. So then it leads to a kind of hypoxic environment, which leads to the development of differentiation syndrome. So you have to believe these patients, if not managed properly, can die very rapid. So first, they present with coagulopathy, should be managed very aggressively with blood product support, platelet support, cryo, FFP as and when required. During the treatment, after a week or 2 weeks, then there comes the differentiation syndrome, which should be managed aggressively. So what should we do for a differentiation patient with a differentiation syndrome? How to save them? So when you have an APML patient in your ward, and you see that the blood counts are more than 10,000, always start steroids. Dexamethasone does wonders in these patients. So always give a prophylactic steroid in high-risk APML patients. And when these patients have these symptoms, start steroid 10 mg twice daily, depending on the weight. Usually the symptoms resolve rapidly. And if symptoms are not resolving, then we may have to stop the treatment. So here, when the patient is in ICU, I think this understanding is very important. So the importance of identification of differentiation syndrome presenting as pulmonary infiltrates and the role of steroid in these patients. So some patients can have fluid overload. They can also have develop anasarca, pleural effusions, congestive heart failure, pneumonia. So they can simultaneously have pneumonia. We can't rule out pneumonia in this patient, but always think of differentiation syndrome first if it's a case of APM. So this is the bleeding part, which see we had patients who has come to diagnosed late in the periphery because these promyelocytes outside in the peripheral centers the morphology they usually mention as neutrophils or shift to left or change of infections. This diagnosis of promyelocytes is very important in these settings. So these patients are diagnosed late and they land up in very bad bleeding. This is a case who came with a large intracranial bleed here. Such a large bleed with midline shift, there is no hope. So once there is intracranial bleed at the presentation, you have to lose hope in these patients. It's very difficult to manage these patients. So diagnose APML early, manage coagulopathy aggressively, and identify differentiation syndrome, give prophylactic steroids. 80 to 90% of the patients will have very good outcomes. So next part in leukemia patient, we have a special challenges. This is also very important. We have BMT unit in Secunderabad Yashoda. Whole hospital should be primed, how these patients behave, how these immunosuppressed patients behave, what the importance of recognizing fever and treating in these patients. So febrile neutropenia. So febrile neutropenia is like, we always discuss with our PGs, what we say is, it's like as an MI to a cardiologist, febrile neutropenia is for a hematologist. We should act very fast. So ideally the blood cultures, antibiotics should be started within an hour of onset of fever in these patients, which makes a lot of huge differences, So patients, that's why when we always treat these patients with leukemias, malignancies, we always advise the patient to stay near to the hospital. We even encourage them to take, home rentals and then stay close to us. So why? Because even if they have fever, sitting somewhere in Nizamabad, Karimnagar, they have to come here. It will take 3 to 4 hours, then go on. There are some patients who have neglected the instructions and have come late in 3 to 4 hours of fever. They landed in septic shock and it was very difficult to resuscitate them and they've expired. So here comes very important role of identifying febrile neutropenia. So definition, it's higher than 38.3 or higher than 38, sustained for more than 1 hour. So neutrophil neutropenia less than 0.5, when it's less than 0.2, it's a profound neutropenia. So again, febrile neutropenia, the risk of febrile neutropenia is different in different subjects. So most of the patients with leukemias, the 2 AMLs, the febrile neutropenia risk is very high. So wherever the neutropenia duration is more than a week, the risk is high. So not every chemotherapy will cause neutropenia. And not related to therapy, the patient's default, take MDS patient, myelodysplastic. If you have a patient of myelodysplastic syndrome in ICU, so he may have counts of 2,000, 2,500. Okay, you may feel that his ANC is good, like 800,000. But still, what you should know, important thing here is, whatever the neutrophils, whatever the myeloid series are dysplastic. What does it mean? They are dysfunctional. There are a lot of granule defects in this patient which cannot mount adequate immune response to the infections here. Always, if you have an MDS patient, even with good ANC count, you should identify them as immunosuppressed patient and should act very aggressively. You can lose a patient MDS even with higher ANC counts. Again, aplastic anemia. Aplastic anemia, there is a special challenge in a leukemia. If you start treating leukemias, so we can expect a recovery. The worst case 2 weeks, 3 weeks. By then 3 weeks, the counts recover and patient is out of neutropenia. Whereas in aplastic anemia, there is a special challenge. So what happens in these patients? Even after starting treatment, forget about diagnosis. Even after starting treatment, these patients will take 1 month, 2 months for the counts to recover. So we have a greater challenge in patients with aplastic anemia. Again, identifying aplastic anemia patients early, referring them, and early treatment in these patients matters a lot. So there will be prolonged neutropenias in these patients, so which can lead to special infections in this patient. So additionally, what are the factors which makes hematological malignancy patients susceptible is the chemotherapy which they have received. So chemotherapy usually it has its own side effects. So common side effect which we see with high intense chemotherapy is the disruption of mucosal barriers. So the risk of gram-negative sepsis is very higher in these patients. And again, usually these patients are critical and usually they will be having some kind of central venous catheter. So again, that serves as a portal of entry in these patients. Again, even hematological cancers, in addition to the neutropenia, they can have additional humoral and cellular immunity defects, which will add fuel to the fire in this patient. So these are it's very important for an intensive care physician to understand all these aspects of patients with leukemias. So what do we do? Usually, febrile neutropenia, these neutropenic patients, usually they don't mount an adequate immune response to the infection. Suppose say a patient, there is a skin infection, they may not have an abscess at all. There can be just erythema over there. Again, erythema is a very important sign of serious infection in these patients because there are no neutrophils to mount a proper immune response. And usually isolated bacterial bugs, isolated or in very less cases, hardly 30% of the case. That's again, one more important thing is always remember to send 2 sets of blood culture in these patients. So which helps us in picking up the infection in these cases. Again, the epidemiology of bacterial infection depends on the center where we do. Usually in our centers, gram-negative bacilli like E. coli, Klebsiella, Pseudomonas are the most commonly isolated. Even fungal infections are also very important kind of infections in these patients. So who are susceptible? So any patient who is on prolonged antibiotic therapy, this patient, any fever lasting for more than a week, you always suspect a fungal infection in these patients, especially neutropenic patient. This mucor is really a deadly infection in this patient. So always leukemia patients, especially AML patients, we always keep them on antifungal prophylaxis. With which drug? Usually we choose a posaconazole, affordable, or voriconazole because of high risk of fungal infections in these patients. So again, clinical assessment is important in these patients. Why? You may not see all the signs in immunocompetent, like immunocompetent patient. Always threshold should be very low in diagnosing infections. First spike of fever, be very aggressive, get an X-ray, can send 2 sets of blood culture, send CUV, then start empirical antibiotic. And also the escalation of antibiotics, we often do very fast in these patients. So why? Because, so till we get sensitivity, we should be very aggressive in these patients, and depending on the clinical scenario, look at the central lines, look for any tenderness, look for any skin changes. So then assess the patient and start. Usually we start with the anti-pseudomonal drug like Piptaz or Cefepime. Then usually we escalate to teicoplanin if there is any signs of gram-positive infection in the body. Then persisting fever, we add antifungal in these patients. Once there is hemodynamic instability or low hypotension, then we straight away switch to colistin. And then in a patient with known cultures or known positive bugs, the multi-resistant bugs, usually we escalate to the sensitive drug straight away. So this is not required. And there are other special hematological emergencies, superior vena cava syndrome, which happens in mediastinal tumors. There again, there are non-hematological conditions which can cause superior vena cava syndrome. It's basically compression of SVC by a mediastinal mass. So in our setting, in our practice, we see high-grade non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, Hodgkin's disease, or T-cell lymphoblastic lymphoma leukemia. All these tumors are chemosensitive. Usually they respond to chemotherapy. So what are the symptoms and signs? Respiratory, stridor, dysphagia, dyspnea, neurological, mental disorders, visual disorders, headache, and there is facial swelling, cyanosis, and visible vessel dilatation on torso. So there is a grading of SVC syndrome based on the symptoms, starting from asymptomatic to fatal. You always act based on the severity of superior vena cava syndrome. So classify the patients based on the symptoms, severity, what they are having. The early stage, always go for biopsy, know the diagnosis, then start treatment. If there's a higher grade, be aggressive. There is a role of stenting in such cases. I'm just skipping, I'm being very brief. So here ends the important malignant hematological emergencies. Sir, how much time do I have, sir?
Talk, so another 5 minutes. So
yeah, then okay. Okay, then I'll briefly brush through TTP. This is also important. Disorder, benign hematological emergency, most often seen in ICU setting. skip the less important parts. This is basically a Coombs negative microangiopathic hemolytic anemia and thrombocytopenia. To put it simply, basically it's a hemolytic anemia, it's microangiopathic in etiology associated with thrombocytopenia. So fever, neurological, renal abnormalities is very simple that in the read in the textbook, but in clinical practice always there's overlap of sepsis, there is overlap other comorbidities, other aspects. Sometimes it really becomes difficult to diagnose this disease. So ASEAF ADAM test TS13 plays a very crucial role, usually which if less rules out other disorders. So common in middle-aged group, more females, acute onset, fulminant course, mortality rate more than 90% in pre-pheresis era. With plasmapheresis, the mortality rate has come down significantly. What are the clinical features? So renal abnormalities and neurological abnormalities, profound weakness related to anemia, and these are the symptoms. The secondary, there can be secondary TTP, which is secondary to drug. Pregnancy following transplant. So we see these cases, post-transplant, sometimes it happens with cyclosporin or just transplant itself. So there are many diseases which can lead to TTP. So TTP is like a common point caused by the multiple etiologies. So always history, clinical examination, the background always should be sorted out. So what happens in TTP? Basically, there is a deficiency of von Willebrand cleaving protease, which leads to accumulation of multimers, leading to platelet aggregation and finally blocking of blood vessels, which leads to narrowing of blood vessels and whatever the lysis of RBCs here. So which leads to thrombocytopenia. Why thrombocytopenia? The platelets are trapped in the clot. So why anemia? It's a narrow lumen, the RBCs are lysed. So causes anemia, thrombocytopenia. So this is Coombs negative. How do we diagnose? So patient with thrombocytopenia less than 20,000 is anemia, high indirect bilirubin, very high LDH, often in thousands, cystocytes in the peripheral blood. So how many cystocytes do you need? The guidelines say more than one cystocyte, 1% is significant in identifying these disorders. So what you should look at combination of signs and symptoms over here. So look at the clinical picture, look at the thrombocytopenia, and then LDH, cystocytes, look for features of hemolysis, send for ADAM TS13 levels. So this is the images showing cystocytes over here. You can see here a broken cell, RBC. This is our normal shape of RBC. Here you can see a helmet shaped cell, which is a broken cystocytes. These are cystocytes. So ADAM TS13 is the confirmatory test. It's very difficult to get the test in lesser time. So that is the limitation as of now. So always TTP differentiate from other important diseases and start plasma exchange as early as possible. So then I'll go to the latest because I have less time. I'll discuss the latest guidelines. Always remember TTP is not an acute disorder, neither it can be cured completely. Always expect relapses in patient when you diagnose TTP. So what's important here is long-term care should be focused in these patients. When you treat a patient, always treat for a short-term intent and for a long-term intent. There comes the latest guidelines, IST's recommendations in these patients. What are the recent recommendations which should be followed in patients of TTP? Now they have first is for adding corticosteroid to the plasma exchange for a patient experiencing a first acute episode of immune TTP or a relapse. So corticosteroid addition benefits a lot in these patients. So the recommendation is to add corticosteroids when a patient is diagnosed with an immune-mediated TTP or in a relapse setting. Second is when you treat a patient, you always focus long-term way to prevent relapses in this patient. How do you prevent relapses? By using rituximab or other latest drug, caplacizumab. I don't have experience with caplacizumab. Rituximab is available. So what does rituximab and these drugs do? Usually they have a beneficial effect in preventing disease relapse. Here that comes, should you add to every patient TTP or you should add in few patients? If it's a relapse case, you always add rituximab. If there is no financial consideration, if you are not worried with infectious complication in a patient, then rituximab can be considered in a patient with a TTP to prevent late relapses. So here ends my presentation. So thanks for the opportunity, sir, and I hope I have conveyed
Yeah, thank you.
important points
Karan Kumar, for
which
that.
can be which are useful.
Yeah, I think that's an enlightening part. I think it is always a pleasure to have a specialist among us during the intensive care reviews, because many of our cases, as you rightly said, it will not be straightforward. It is mix of many organ dysfunctions, including, as you said, sepsis contributes a major chunk in our add-on complexities. Along with that, not just oncological situations, we do get direct patients post-pregnancy. We have seen recently a patient landing up with hemolytic anemia with thrombocytopenia and renal failure. So we were struggling, and you have been involved in that. In the similar situation, we have cases non-oncologically also. We have seen young patients landing up with acute renal shutdown. Then we later on try to find out about the cystocytes and a marginal thrombocytopenias. Then marrow, the renal biopsy later on confirmed that there is a TMA phenomenon. Cortical thrombosis and cortical necrosis, basically renal cortical necrosis, was many of the times we seen as a clue. So we will first, I think, take some questions which are there in chat box. Then we will come back to our discussion. So one of our critical care students were asking, how do you differentiate between a pulmonary infection and a differentiation syndrome, which you mentioned with ATRA?
Yeah. So I'll have a small, simple statement. So you call a person guilty unless proven innocent. If it's a case of APML, it is differentiation syndrome unless proved otherwise. So because see, the infections are more common in leukemias, I agree. So why the infections are high? Because of the neutropenia. So whereas in APML, we have a peculiar situation. So there are neutrophils in these patients. So the infectious complications are less when compared to the other leukemias. So the chance of pulmonary part being infection is less likely than differentiation syndrome. Again, the setting is important. When a patient comes to you at the presentation, so with pulmonary infiltrates and respiratory symptoms and all, so it's an infection usually. So differentiation syndrome, the context is very important here. Here you have a APML patient who is on treatment. So for a week or 2 weeks, usually the shortest duration where differentiation syndrome can develop is 7 days. Okay. So usually differentiation syndrome, you don't call a differentiation syndrome in a patient with respiratory symptoms who presents to you with APML. Okay. So the context is important. What is the context here? Patient on ATRA or all-trans retinoic acid, arsenic trioxide, on treatment for 7 days, 8 days. Now the counts are going up slowly. What's happening here? The promyelocytes are differentiating into neutrophils, and the count slowly climbs up. There comes the relevance of differentiation syndrome. In a APML patient on treatment with increasing WBC count, if you have a patient in the ward developing fever, respiratory symptoms, shortness of breath, you think of differentiation syndrome first. So other ways to, anyway, we send for sputum for routine cultures. And usually procalcitonin is one of the marker, but it's not much reliable in these settings, hyperinflammatory settings. Usually it's the context which helps us in diagnosing a differentiation syndrome. Always you start an antibiotic, then give steroid. Usually these patients will have a very fast response, very quick response with the steroid. And also one more important feature is, along with the respiratory symptoms, if you monitor closely with these patients, you can see a positive urine output balance in these patients. You see a patient with differentiation syndrome landing in severe differentiation syndrome. You look at the intake output chart closely, you would have noticed slight positivity each day, and you would have gained weight slowly. This is very, very important thing. So what I do in my practice, I closely monitor the intake output of the patient very closely from day one, very strict instructions, daily weight 2 times. If I see urine output becoming positive, if the weight of the patient slowly, gradually goes up, I start steroid. I start steroid and I use Lasix. I make the fluid balance negative. Usually we don't get a complication that even then few patients can land up in, even now I have in the ward, I have a patient with same was becoming positive slowly, was gaining weight. I started Lasix, I started prophylactic steroid low dose. Then he started developing SOB fever. Then I escalated steroid to standard dose of 10 mg twice daily. Then symptoms immediately reduced within few hours. In fact, I was thought of shifting him to ICU, but didn't happen. Now almost 5-6 days now, he's doing well. I'm planning to discharge him in a few days here.
Yeah, so that's a actually interesting part. There is a overlap of all the symptoms, as you said, fever, leukocytosis, which are generally a reflection of infection. But in this context, the differential syndrome will come in front. Proven otherwise, as you said, a rapid response to steroid should be considered as that. If the patient is not responding, steroid worsening, probably you more aggressively go for a possibility of infection by probably invasive bronchial vas and antimicrobial. There are interesting two more questions. I think one is related to how frequently you see TRALI with SDP transfusion. Do you really recommend a target platelet count? As you said, these patients will have a coagulation related hemorrhage as one of the early complications.
So the question first part is, how many cases of TRALI have been reported in patients with leukemias with multiple SDP transfusion? So when we have patient, if AML or ALL, these patients, usually we keep a target count of 20,000. In fact, some few centers follow 15,000 cutoff. Suppose say there is a fever, then the threshold rises, even 20,000, we tend to transfuse platelets. So if you manage a patient in this phase, say ALL or AML, AML is a 4-week admission and ALL depends on the case. It lasts from 2 weeks to 3 weeks to 4 weeks. These patients usually require one SDP average in 3 to 4 days once. Okay. So by the end of their admission, they would have received some 4 or 5 SDP transfusions. So far, I have seen some 2 to 3 patients developing TRALI with platelet support, that too not later to start with. So there are 2-3 patients, all the recent 2 patients developed. Once we started SDP, they have developed lung infiltrates and SOB and all. So we could manage conservatively in these patients. But there is nothing relation with the number. It's a predisposition more of to the TRALI. Each patient is different. Yeah. Okay.
And the other question is, many of the times you clinically suspect a TTP. As you said, the pantad is not always a common phenomenon. You may have a clinical context with suspicion of TTP. So how early you start a plasmapheresis in them without going to, or you wait for a ADAM-TS report to come, or you investigate some way to confirm it? How do you actually select these patients to go for a plasmapheresis?
Yeah, then you should know how a classic TTP presents. We have seen classic TTP patient, no fever, fever kind of will be there, but how a non-septic patient looks like, how a patient without infection looks like. We all know that. So such is the look of a classic TTP patient. So when you have a patient who has other comorbidities, some infection sitting over there, high procal levels and deranged PT-APTT, then you think there is something else is going on. In such cases, when the diagnosis is doubtful, then if there is no contraindication for plasmapheresis, you can go ahead with the plasmapheresis, because as early as you start, the more the good the outcome is. So classic TTP, you will not have doubt at all. So it's an instinct, when there is a classic TTP sitting in the ICU, you will not have any doubt. So we'll have a doubt when there's a patient with other comorbidities, overlap of infection and other parts, going on. Then you think whether do plasmapheresis or not. In such cases, ask one question: is there a contraindication for the plasmapheresis or not? What are the finances the patient on? If you think it's more of infection, less of TTP, always send ADAM-TS13 levels. So recently, I've done a lot of research and I found out labs who will do ADAM-TS13 in 2 days. You get those details, try to send the ADAM-TS13 levels and get the report, and then you can take a call to do plasmapheresis or not. If there is no contraindication, if you feel like it's more towards TTP, then you should go ahead with the plasmapheresis.
Yeah, but Dr. Karan Kumar, we have seen ADAM-TS13 sometimes turn to be negative, which we know can be a phenomenon. The levels are not too low to detect it to be defining it at TTP. But we have seen the renal biopsy in the later part, in a week or two, realizing there is a definite TMA in them. So how do you, or what is your experience in that? How frequently you see ADAMTS 13 add and helping you out?
This is not a very common disorder, so I will not have much experience. But what I can say is usually these patients would have received some kind of blood product support, some plasma, some platelets, or some initially when they were not diagnosed with TTP. So the plasma levels can fluctuate and can show normal in a report. That is one error what we can see in these patients. The other part is usually ADAMTS 13, the sensitivity of the test and the laboratory quality, we don't know. Usually ADAMTS 13 levels is very sensitive test. If it is normal, it rules out TTP almost, because the pathogenesis in TTP is reduced ADAMTS 13 levels. And second is formation of acquired antibodies, which are targeting ADAMTS 13. So maybe that case, I have no idea. So maybe the plasma support or blood product support might have caused false levels.
Yeah, there is a question from Dr. Prusti. He asks how you manage neutropenic enterocolitis.
Yeah, again, it's a very important question. And see, these patients, when any patient, comes with, recently I had 2 patients. So one patient came with a high blood counts, start with abdominal pain. It was diagnosed as AML, and in fact, he had very low counts, 500, 600. So now this is a very difficult scenario. He has a leukemia with counts of 600, and he has a abdominal pain. From assessment of USG abdomen and CT abdomen, it was a neutropenic enterocolitis. So what should I do with this patient? Should I give chemotherapy, aggravate neutropenia, lead to sepsis and bad complications, or should I wait? So how waiting will help in this patient? Already he has neutropenia. So waiting is not going to help at all in these patients. So such cases are very difficult to manage. Usually they end up having some sepsis and then landing up in ICU. Otherwise, usually what we do, any patient starts with, usually we suspect neutropenic enterocolitis in any patient if he has a abdominal pain, abdominal distension, or loose stools. These are the 3 important. Fever, with fever just alone, there is very rare chance of having neutropenic enterocolitis. One of these symptoms, we suspect enterocolitis. We do ultrasound scan, which usually shows a thickening of the bowel segments. Once the enterocolitis is diagnosed, then what we do, usually we avoid solid foods in these patients. We encourage liquid, clean liquids in these patients to allow the recovery. These patients will require very aggressive antibiotic support covering gram-positive, gram-negative bugs. Usually we escalate it to meropenem. If required, we will add colistin in these patients. So only antibiotics and rest to gut. So we have to wait. So depends when at what point of time this patient develop the complication. This before starting chemotherapy, or in between chemotherapy, or in the almost during the recovery. This decides the outcome a lot. Say to start with chemotherapy, there's no hope. Almost. Between chemotherapy, now how far is the neutrophil count recovery is awaited? Okay, that decides the outcome. Suppose it's 10 to 15 days, again, it's a big challenge. Suppose the patient is very close to neutrophil recovery and has neutropenic enterocolitis, then matter of days, the neutrophil comes out and the healing happens. So it depends on the point where the patient develops neutropenic enterocolitis. And usually antibiotic support is the only modality, and gut rest to gut.
Okay. There is another debate on that leukocyte transfusion. See, in severe refractory neutropenia, as you said, less than 100 and not responding to any form of your recovery. So what is the role, and where are we right now in leukocyte transfusions?
Yeah, this is called granulocyte support. It's a kind of, like similar to SDP collection. In SDP, we don't prime a donor. Here, what we do is we give a growth factor 12 hours prior to the procedure. We give a short dose of steroid, which is half an hour post growth factor. The next day, after 12 hours, we call the donor. We usually do group matching. We prefer group matching here. We collect the same group granulocytes in the FRSS machine. So it's we target usually 300 to based on the weight, and target the volume. And this is transfused within 6 hours to the patient. So when should we give this, and when is it useful? Okay, that is the question, right? So say we'll take the same case, a patient with neutropenic enterocolitis sitting in a ward. Okay, so he has developed this, suppose say AML chemotherapy lasts for 4 weeks. The neutropenic enterocolitis developed around day 20 of chemotherapy. Now AML, what happens by the end of day 24, 25, the neutrophil count starts coming up. So you have a 5 days of waiting time. The patient is going into sepsis now. So would you want to lose patient sepsis, or will you intervene and do anything here? So there comes the role of granulocyte support. Short neutrophil recovery, then you use granulocyte support generously. So what you do, you collect the granulocyte support and transfuse within 6 hours. Always irradiate, very important. Irradiate the product, otherwise patient will end up in a big mess. So irradiate the product and then transfuse. Usually you expect, suppose say patient of 100 WBC, you expect a recover count increment of some 600,000, which will last for a day or two. So what does it mean? Again, you have to repeat the procedure on day 2 and day 3. If it's a good collection, you can use it for, you can transfuse one granulocyte collection for once in 2 days, alternate day. So you transfuse 2 granulocyte support, bring the patient out of sepsis. By the day, in few 6-7 days, the neutrophil count comes up and then patient is out of danger. So I have given you an ideal situation where you should use granulocyte support. Now say a patient is landed up in neutropenic enterocolitis to start with, initial chemotherapy. You just started chemotherapy and patient landed in neutropenic enterocolitis. So what you should do? So what you should do, then there's a waiting time of 3 weeks, right? So here, this will not at all help. In fact, this may harm the patient more and drain the finances very badly. So there'll be multiple issues over here. So always use granular support when the neutrophil recovery is expected very fast. And then that is the indication here.
So how do Buffy-Co transfusion helps in such cases? One of the
that's a very important question. So suppose say, how much does granulocyte collection cost? SDP, we all know 13 to 15,000 bucks. Granulocyte, the kit costs a lot, nearly 30,000 bucks. Every granulocyte collection will be nearly 30 to 40,000 in a patient. It's huge money involved. So it's not easy. You need to motivate the donor. So if we find people who are not willing for even simple blood donation, now the donor has to be motivated to take a growth factor, then to take a DEXA tablet, then has to come for a donation. There lies the limitation of granulocyte support. So sorry, come again. What is your question, sir?
Buffy-Co.
Yeah, Buffy-Co. Yeah. So cost is the main limiting factor in the granulocyte. So in such cases, you can use Buffy-Co. In these patients, Buffy-Co is easily made, but you have to use multiple blood products. This can be easily collected. In blood bank, what happens usually, the cell separation happens routinely. So Buffy-Co usually is discarded. So here you have to collect Buffy-Co, but usually it's not efficacious. There are a lot of problems with it. There will be a lot of cell lysis happening. So there can be problems with Buffy-Co. But in less resource constraint settings, you have a patient with neutropenic enterocolitis or any other severe infection, the neutrophil count recovery is expected very fast. You don't want to lose patient. Definitely you can give a try for.
So you mean to say only in the situation where you have a bridging scope for a few days?
Exactly. That is very important.
So
otherwise, no point. Nobody can afford granulocytes for 24 days. Sorry, 12
there is
days.
Another question. What is the role of eculizumab in TTP management?
Eculizumab has no role. So it has only role in.
So for the point of discussion, I wanted to bring some other discussions like, see, many of these TTP cases, we overlap with the TMA. So you very precisely pointed out you need a negative direct CUM in them. You have to exclude a autoimmune hemolytic anemia, then you come to microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. So many of us overlap these two things. What is a TMA and microangiopathic hemolytic anemia? Will you enlighten on those two parts?
See, microangiopathic hemolytic anemia, what does it mean? The vessel is getting blocked by aggregates, which are narrowing the lumen. Okay. So, which leads to the pressured blood flow through the narrowed lumen, which causes lysis of RBCs. we don't use this word in case of Coombs positive hemolytic anemia. In Coombs positive hemolytic anemia, what happens? The antibody mediated cell lysis happens. Okay. These are the two different things. So TTP, what happens? It's a microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. So Coombs negativity, sometimes what happens? So most of the patients will be sick, severe anemia. They would have received some blood transfusions earlier. So transfusion itself can cause some false positive Coombs test in these patients. So DCT in such cases, usually we don't get a strong positive Coombs. Always when the Coombs is positive, always ask the blood bank, discuss with them, how bad is the hemolysis in the Coombs reagent. Okay. Usually those cases, transfusion associated Coombs positive will be very mild things. And usually we have some indirect Coombs test positivity in them. We'll have some alloantibody sitting over there. So these can be differentiated with the help of blood bank support.
Okay. When comes the TMA, this is about MAHA, microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. Then we add TMA. As we all know, all TMAs can be a MAHA, but all MAHAs may not be a TMA. So how do you differentiate between them? See, you never almost may not see always the thrombosis to happen.
See, other MAHAs are what atypical hemolytic uremic syndrome. They have the clinical picture, renal involvement. So will be different. And atypical HUS, where there's a complement mediated, usually the clinical history background and the clinical context usually helps us in identifying these cases.
So the other question is, do all these malignant spinal cord compressions require a surgery? I think most of them you spoke about stent, but not the surgery in cases of the stage 4 where there is a compression. That's what you mentioned, I believe.
Yeah, stent is in that SVC.
So there is actually antiuremic drugs in tumor lysis syndrome. So will you like to enlighten on when there is a involved renal issues, there is an AKI or there is an ongoing CKD, the choice of your uremic drugs changes?
When there is a renal involvement.
Renal involvement.
Yeah, we prefer
renal failure.
In tumor lysis, expect the high uric acid levels. So usually febuxostat is the one which we prefer. Second again, rasburicase. See, even so, what we should understand the pathophysiology behind the renal involvement in such cases. If it is secondary to high uric acid levels, there will be excellent response to rasburicase, and you see renal parameters improving drastically within few days over the time. Last few 2-3 patients I had T-cell ALL presenting in with AKI and high classic features of ALS. They responded beautifully to steroids, rephase, and with rasburicase. If there is a background CKD, so I have no idea.
Okay. So I think we had a wonderful interaction and discussion, Dr. Karan Kumar. We know the clinical context will be more important in intensive care unit where there is a overlap of many phenomena happening, ongoing sepsis, multi-organ failure, DIC, hemolysis, transfusions, which actually mix up things. And probably this information will enlighten us all, and probably a specialist like you help in guiding the teams when they require a teamwork. And with this, I thank all the participants. I thank Dr. Karun Kumar for presenting this presentation, and I conclude the session. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I think, sir.